Welcome to Leominster Access Television and Neighborhood Snapshot. My name is Bob Saudelli. I am a member of the Leominster Historical Commission. Today we are pleased to welcome John P. Mahan, Barbara Mahan Obishon, and Linda Mahan Pinder, and we are going to be discussing and reminiscing about their growing up in Morse Hollow. We also welcome today at our studios Pat Mahan Pinder and her daughter Diana Pinder, who are watching this taping. Looking at Jack, you will see a familiar face. Jack Mahan, John P. Mahan, you will recognize him. He was a long-time city councilor, member of the Leominster City Council for 26 years. He was mayor of the city of Leominster from 1992-93, two-year term. All of the Barbara and Jack and Pat are children of former state representative Arthur U. Mahan, who, by the way, is honored by the bridge. Where is the bridge, Jack?
It's the bridge on Route 12 heading toward the Marshall Mall, it's the bridge that goes over Route 2, and it's the Arthur U. Mahan Memorial Bridge. Named after my father.
After your dad. Linda is a trustee of the Leominster Historical Society, and Jack, Linda, and Pat are charter members of the Genealogical Society, the Nash Gen. How do you say it?
Actually, I am.
Okay.
Nash Gen.
Nash Gen is the Nashaway Genealogical Society, and it's actually Barbara, Pat, and I who are members of that. Barbara's the vice president, and we all three of us are on the board of directors there.
So you folks are very much interested in history and genealogy. Mm-hmm. I also want to mention that after State Rep Arthur U. Mahan passed away, many of you probably remember State Representative Robert Mahan, who, now what the relationship was?
He was our uncle.
Your uncle. Mm-hmm. So as we will see in this, out in the anteroom, we started chit-chatting, prepping for this, and I'm really eventually just going to let the Mahans and the Pinders loose and just converse with each other, because it was fascinating. It really is fascinating. I have some historical stuff I'm going to read about Morse Hollow, Morseville, which is interesting in itself, but once you hear the folks talk, it's really, really, really wonderful. Let's start by, for the folks new to Leominster, where is Morse Hollow? Let me begin with Linda.
Well, Morse Hollow is basically Exchange Street, or used to be Exchange Street, bordered by West Street and Birch Street. That was considered Morse Hollow. But as the years went on and more was built up, there was more of an area covered in Morse Hollow. It went further up Exchange Street, where there was a lot of industry.
The hollow part of the name. Now, this photograph, which is a very old photograph, shows
1870.
1870.
Right.
It shows Morse Hollow, and if you were to drive down today, if you were to turn left off West Street onto Exchange Street, and then you get, it actually dips. It's a hollow. There's a dip in there.
Yeah, from about View Street, Bowtell Street, all the way down to Birch. There's a hollow, and that's where the name came from. And of course, it was built up by the Morse family in the 1800s, and it was known as Morseville or Morse Hollow. And
so that's the Morse part of it and the hollow part of it. And as Jackie just mentioned, it was also known later as Morseville.
Yes.
And it was quite as we'll get into in a little bit, it was quite a bustling place, a little village. This photograph I found most interesting when I guess now who found it originally? Did Linda?
I
you,
did. It was
you
at
came
the
in-
Historical
the
Society.
Historical Society, and if you look at this photograph, now that hill in the background is.
It was the Skeeto, I think.
Up by the Skeeto,
Yeah.
and you look at it, and there are no trees, essentially no trees. It's pasture land. You see stone walls running across it, and it's interesting because actually today, in 2004, in this area, there are more woods and forests than there were then because there are fewer farms today. But that was farmland and pasture land then, and it's a most interesting picture. And this is the house where, Jack, you still reside.
I live there, yeah.
You still live there, and some of these buildings are still, and houses are still there. And we'll show you a picture of one that is still there. This is a beautiful brick building, and
That's on Birch Street,
on
Bob.
Birch Street.
Right.
It's a beautiful building. It's still there, and I'll wager that the bricks in that building were probably manufactured in the brick mill right in Morse Hollow because
Right.
there was a
Right.
brick manufacturing mill.
Right
And
up
if
at the top of the
The
street.
top of Birch
at
Street, there
Birch
was the
and
brickyard.
Clark and,
there was a
Elm.
brickyard, and if you drive into that area now, Birch Street and Morse Hollow, you will see some of the brick buildings, and some of them have the facade of the brick.
And the other thing, too, notice the granite lintels over the windows and the door, and most likely those came from the granite quarry.
Which
So it was an entire neighborhood
right.
build.
and the quarry, I'm going to put this picture back for a moment. The quarry up on Granite Street, which produced Leominster granite, many of the old houses in Leominster, probably virtually all of them, had foundations, many of them that had granite foundations. That granite was quarried at the quarry up there, and this is a quote from a fellow named Jim Moran, and when we went over this before, some of you are familiar with Jim Moran. Maybe you can tell us a little something about him in a moment, but it was from July 11th, 1970, and he quotes, "The old road, which is an extension of Exchange Street, used to see heavy traffic from horse-drawn wagons. The wagons, with their heavy loads of granite, I'll insert, would cut right through the heart of Morse Hollow." So those granite wagons would come down off the quarry and probably come right through this road. The wagons with the heavy loads would cut right through the heart of Morse Hollow. Quote, "You should have seen them trying to make it down the hill," end quote, would say Charlie Corners, a lifelong resident of Morse Hollow before he passed away a few years. And he even said, his quote, I seen a couple of them tip over, but nobody ever got killed," end quote. And Charlie would relate his stories to the children of the Hollow and anyone else willing to listen. So did you know Jim Moran? Did you know?
Yes, we knew the Moran family. Actually, Jimmy was the youngest of the family, and he really has done a lot of nice writing. And he wrote his mother's obituary. It was just beautiful about the girls from the flats, or where is it, over in Doylefield? You know, the
Plains.
The Plains.
Plains.
Yep.
The Plains.
Another neighborhood.
Yeah, and he's very interesting.
He sounds.
Jim lived, his family lived in the house that I'm living in now. When we grew up, in fact, I eventually bought the house from Jim Moran's father in the early 60s. And we grew up in the house just above that house that shows in the photo. My father built the house that my sister Pat and her family are living in 1935, and that was a former pasture land. And interestingly enough, I remember my dad telling me that as a boy, of course everybody had a barn and everybody had some livestock, and they had a couple of cows in his family, and they were grazing up above on that land which was vacant. And he was sent out to get them one night just before a storm. And while he was driving them home, a lightning flash came and hit him, and I think killed one of the cows.
Wow.
And so that's a bit of history in the Hollow.
Sure
And
is.
there's a lot of interesting things that happened, and everybody has a lot of stories. And it was a very interesting place to grow up in, and it's still an interesting place to live in.
And you've lived there all your life, Jack.
Yep, except for my service in the Army when I was out of the country for a couple of years. Leominster's always been my home.
And your sister Pat
Yeah,
also
and
still lives
she's
there.
living in the family homestead, which is just above the house in the photo. Yeah, and
when my folks came back to Leominster after living in New York, I was born in New York, but when they came back to Leominster, they bought a house next to Jack and his family, and Barbara and I became very, very close friends, and Pat, of course, but Barbara and I were in the same grade in school, so of course we were buddies,
was that the one-room
besides being
schoolhouse?
cousins.
No, George Street.
That was definitely not the one-room schoolhouse, which was on Birch Street, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Right.
But it was George Street. It was George Street School, right? But
Yeah, I started out at Field School.
Field
So
School.
ironically, here I am back again, spending all that
That's
time
right.
at the
that-
Historical
because
Society.
that's where the offices, the headquarters of the Leominster Historical
Yeah.
Society are
Yeah.
located. This picture of this brick building, which we mentioned, and made probably from the bricks manufactured at the brick mill, the brickyard, I came across a reference. I believe this was used as a rooming house for some of the workers in the area
It was.
at one time, who worked in Morse Hollow, the Morseville area. This distinguished-looking gentleman, who is this? If you look, you can't the camera probably can't focus in on the eyes, but I look at those eyes and I see Jack. Jack, who is this
That would have
gentleman?
been my grandfather, John Thomas Mahan.
John Thomas Mahan.
And he's got quite a mustache there. I've never been able to duplicate it, so I've never tried.
And this lady, this is, who is she?
That-
She's our mutual great-grandmother.
That's a great-grandmother.
Now we're really going back. Now, approximately what would, I know I'm kind of springing this question on you, but approximately what year, or what the 18?
And when did they come in? 70?
I would say
1874?
1870s.
Sometime after,
1880,
shortly after the
yeah.
Civil War.
Yeah.
No, they came earlier.
Yeah.
Well, our great-grandfather came from Ireland in, I believe it was 1862. He was 15.
So during the Civil
He
War.
and his brother.
He and his
Yeah.
brother came. And then they met, or he met his wife. I think they were married like when they were 20.
Okay, so a great-grandmother, and then
That would be our great-grandfather.
great-grandfather.
That would be the, yes.
Mother.
and
That
great-grandfather.
was like
that
a
was the
wedding
lady
picture,
that you just
wasn't
saw.
it? Wasn't
Yeah.
that a wedding picture?
Yes, it was.
Was that Philip?
A wedding picture.
Yeah, Philip
That's
Henry.
Philip Henry.
Philip
Yeah.
yeah.
Philip Henry.
So they've been there a while, and of course,
Now, Philip Henry, the last name?
Mahan.
Mahan.
Mahan,
Philip Henry
yeah.
Mahan.
And he and his wife, Mary Ellen, married, I think, in Lowell. And they came to Leominster to live. We're not sure exactly why, but they had several children before they came to Leominster. And as far as we know, he followed the rivers. He worked in some of the mills and he followed the rivers. So he lived in places along the river in New Hampshire, we know, and possibly Lowell, and ultimately ended up in Leominster. And that brick house that you just saw was he and his family all grown up.
Okay. And now this is Linda's this is one of Linda's, about Linda, this
Yeah, the fellow in the center
dapper-looking
is,
gentleman,
yeah, and that would be
Gentleman.
Daniel Mahan,
Daniel Mahan.
right?
And these are his buddies, and I see he has some medals. And what's the story behind this picture?
I have no idea as far as the medals go. I'm not sure exactly what he received them for, but he was in the Spanish-American War.
Spanish-American War.
And on the left-hand side, on lower than him, he's in the middle, and on the left-hand side would be one of his brothers, and then the other gentlemen were people in his troop. And I was fortunate enough to be to acquire his diary from the Spanish-American War, which tells on a day-by-day basis the kind of life he lived. Yeah.
Fascinating. I can see the interest in the genealogy here.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. And then we were very fortunate also in that we have a cousin who put us in touch with a lot of these pictures, a person who lives in Berlin. And she was so kind in coming down and telling us. We met her at a funeral, first of all. We didn't know she was our cousin. And when we were introduced and she said she had pictures of our great-grandparents, we were thrilled. So I got in touch with Barbara and we went and saw this wonderful lady. And she told us wonderful stories about them and about her family all growing up. And it did spur our genealogical bug, I guess. And Barbara and I subsequently went to Ireland a few years ago and did some research on the family. So one thing leads to another. It's a wonderful thing.
It is, it is. I'm going to put these back up here, and I'll put the one of Morse Hollow itself in the 1870s. I notice there's, I'll read some names of some of the families, other families in Morse Hollow. And we'll see the connection in a moment. The Foleys, the Hardys, the Walshes, Allards, O'Connors, Sharons, O'Hearns, Chesters, Harringtons, Mahans, Niles, Allens, Chases, Morse, Davis, Cook, Walshes, Sullivans, Gates, etc. There are quite a few names that have an Irish ring to them. So were there a lot of Irish Americans who immigrants who emigrated from Ireland and settled in eventually in the Morse Hollow area?
I think it's like any other immigration. You know, when you have relatives or friends who live in a certain area in a new country, and you know of them, or you know of a friend or something, you might want to settle near them just to kind of ease in comfortably to a new country, because somebody else has already gone before you. So I think that was a very prevalent thing. Certainly in Leominster, we have people who lived in the plains who are of Irish descent. And I think we had a very strong pocket of Irish descent also in Morse Hollow. Strong.
And that's so typical. And even today, when new folks come to America, they tend to live where people they're familiar with. Sure. And then eventually, we hope that everyone blends in and becomes, which over time we become Americanized, which is wonderful. A melting pot.
Oh, it is. And all you have to do is look at Leominster, and especially many of these segments that you have done, Bob, in the oral history of Leominster, and talk to some of the folks, and you can see the influence from the immigration from Canada, the Canadian, French Canadian, and the Irish who came to America somewhere around the 1860s. The potato famine drove a lot of those folks out of Ireland, and they came to America's shores, and they found their way. Some of them were brick masons, some of them were stone people. There was a quarry here in Leominster. Many of them worked in the mills, and they came here. And then 1900, you had a strong immigration from Italy, and your Italian population started to swell here in Massachusetts, and of course here again in Leominster. The Lincoln Terrace section of Leominster, when I was growing up, was basically all Italian.
Yes.
But they had been preceded by the Irish, and I think the last Irish family up on the terrace was the Lundigan family.
I remember.
And they were
right on
teachers
the end of,
at the junior high school.
Yes.
And so it's fascinating. And then, of course, other folks came in from other cultures. There were Germans and Swedish and Finnish people. And then we had some of the black families in Leominster. And then in later years, you had your influx from Puerto Rico. And now you have quite a smattering of Brazilian and South American folks. So it's a grand
yes, it is.
melting pot right here in our community. And it's so good. That's what's kept America strong and vital over the years, too.
That melting pot image.
Absolutely.
Which ideally we hope it's one out of many. You know,
sure.
One out of many.
Yeah.
Looking at this picture, it's kind of bucolic and rustic and rural, but I'm going to read, before we let the Mahans and Pinders loose and just chit-chat, this is between 1845 and 1853, there was a large expansion in the comb business, much of which occurred in Morseville, Morse Hollow. During that time, 4 two-story houses, 1 store, 9 one-story cottages, 1 house, and 4 large mills, one of which employed 200, were built. Most of these buildings are no longer existent. In May 1860, the brick mill burned, and the comb business was carried on in what had been a piano shop. On May 31st, 1860, a chair shop was destroyed. In December 3rd, 1877, a fire completely destroyed one of the earliest of the Morse comb shops. Gardner and Augustus Morse continued in the comb business with various other partners until the Civil War, when Augustus joined the Army, and it goes on. There was also, up the street, the Spills Brothers manufacturing establishment, where they manufactured combs, I believe from tortoise shells at the beginning. There was a dam. You can still see the remains of it, I believe, up on Slack Brook, which is a little tributary of Monusnock Brook. But Slack Brook, I believe there was a water wheel there to supply the power for the factory. So it was a very, very busy place in the early days. Now,
Can I add a few more things to that? One of the things that you might not know is that when Gardner and Augustus Morse came in, and they were in charge of these 4 factories, one of those factories alone was doing $100,000 a year. That's a huge amount of money for that time.
Yes.
So, and after they built all these houses, they built them for their employees mostly. They also built a country store. And there was talk at one time of them having a postal.
I came across that. Yes, there was.
I found that really fascinating.
Yeah.
So they would have had really their own little town, Morseville, which was why it was named that. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was that they were the very first ones to use steam and water power together. So, you know, they were really innovative. We were very fortunate to have them. And alongside the burning of all these things, before that, there was I want to say no, I can't even remember the date, but there was a decline in money there was a lot going on in the United States, and it affected Leominster as well, and they lost a lot of money. So they were going to be out of business anyway. Then when the Civil War came, Augustus was called upon by the governor to outfit troops. So again, he was a very, very important man. We owe a lot to the Morses.
Was Augustus, I came across one of the Morses who was a general, Was that?
That was he.
Augustus.
Yes. Yeah.
Augustus Morse. The only remaining manufacturing establishment in Morse Hollow is E.B. Kingman's, which parts of the building perhaps date back to that time, but on that site there was early manufacturing too. I'm not sure. I think there may have been a horseshoe nail shop somewhere. I'm not sure. I came across that reference
I don't know,
somewhere.
but of course it was plastics.
Oh, yes,
You know,
more
when we
recently.
were growing up.
Yes,
And
yes.
Barbara has a wonderful story to tell about the pond at E.B. Kidman's.
We're going to get in now. Let's let the Mahans. Let's start let the Mahans and Pinders loose. When you were, we know where Morse Hollow is. We know why it's called Morse Hollow. You folks grew up there in the 40s and 50s. That's when you were kids, children, and young teenagers, probably around that time. What are some of your, let's start sharing some of your personal memories of Morse Hollow. A lot of the other neighborhoods were fairly removed from downtown Leominster, but you were very, very close to downtown Leominster. Did you get downtown a lot, Jack?
Oh, sure. You know, everybody walked everywhere in those days. There were buses that ran, and some folks had cars, not everyone, but we walked to George Street School, and that's where the housing for the elderly is today. And then, of course, when we got out of George Street School, we walked down to the
May
May A. Gallagher Junior High School.
Junior
In
High.
fact, when I went there, May A. Gallagher was still the principal. It was just called the Junior High School. There wasn't a name for it,
Right.
but of course it was named after her. And then when I went to high school, the high school was on West Street, where the building still remains today. It was called Carter
Which
Junior
became
High
Carter
at,
Junior
at
High,
one
but the old
time.
Leominster High
But that
School.
was the old Leominster High School before the new one was built in the early 60s. And so we had access to everything, and we could walk up to Barrett Pond, Barrett Park. We would walk up Birch Street through the old brickyard and through the woods to Barrett's. Took our swimming lessons there. We would swim at Smith's Pond, which is off Granite Street. My father and mother would take us up there after supper nights, on hot nights, and we could swim there. We would walk downtown to doctors and dental appointments, and of course every little neighborhood had its own little markets and stores then.
What was the market in your
Well,
neighborhood?
right at the head of Exchange Street, where the barber shop and the baseball card shop is now, there was a market run by the Griffin family, who still live on Exchange Street. And on the other corner, which is a house now, but it's a multi-family dwelling, there was another little market run by a man named Harold Bennett, and who was a former meat cutter for the First National Stores, which were located downtown. And then there was two other markets on Merriam Avenue. Mr. Smith ran a market where the tanning salon is now. And then there was the Crossman's Market, former Mayor Crossman's Market, which is the Honey Farms variety store now.
Yeah.
And so we had access to everything, and ball fields, Doyle Field, you know, we lacked for nothing. And we were centralized enough that we could move freely. So we got around quite nicely.
And most of the time it was foot power.
Yes, but you know, buses to Whalen
buses.
Park and other things like that, sure.
We used to walk downtown on Saturday afternoon and go to the movies. Remember the cereals? And I remember we paid 14 cents.
14 cents to get into the
And
movies.
there would be a double feature
Yes.
and cartoon
Cartoons.
probably,
And the
Right.
news.
in the newsreel, cereal,
And coming attractions.
coming attractions.
It was fun.
It was fun, and the movie theaters would have been the Metropolitan
And
the
Plymouth.
Plymouth
Mhm.
in that era.
And the Rialto.
And the Rialto was, you remember that where the Leominster Recreation Center used to be. Now it was a mortgage company until recently, and it's a church, but right on the corner of and fairly opposite Columbia Block Post Office area, the Rialto Theater. used to swim at Barrett Park, Smith's Pond. Barbara fell in to Kingman's Pond. Can you tell us about that, please? And we have, what's the story
We had a
on
lot
that?
of happy memories of Kingman's and Kingman's Pond, and all the kids in the neighborhood used to go fishing, and you didn't have to have a fishing pole. You just had to have a stick with a fishing line on it, and we dug up worms and put the bait on the hooks and all that. And one year I can remember, our father was a state rep, but it wasn't a year-round job. And at his aunt's house at 103 Exchange Street, he used to have gardens where he raised blue Hubbard squash. And he was working in the gardens, and Jack and I were fishing at Kingman's on the other side of the street. We had to go through the fence and everything. And there was a fairly swift current, so it must have been in the spring. And my line got caught on something. And I guess I leaned over to try to get it loose. And my hat fell in the pond. I fell in the pond. And Jack ran to get our father, so, and I grabbed the root of the tree, but I had to grab my hat. And, and I managed, and they got me out and everything, but...
Must have worked, because she's here.
Still here. But I'd hate to try to get through that fence today, wouldn't you?
Yes.
But he also, every year, he raised the blue Hubbard squash that he sold to Bobo's Market and Barrier's Market on 3rd Street. And he'd get 500 baby chicks in the spring. And he raised all those chickens and sold the eggs. And then in the fall, I think most of the chickens were slaughtered and went to market. And I know I hated chicken. I couldn't stand eating chicken for years. But we used to help to gather the eggs, and he'd slaughter the chickens himself in the old barn, and had the boiling, big tubs of scalding water. And after he had done his job and everything, and the chickens were dipped in the hot water, and we went in and we plucked the feathers. And that wasn't too bad, but I didn't want to eat them.
It was interesting when you go back to those days, because this is a throwaway society that we're in today, but everything was used when we were kids growing up. And my sister talked about my father buying the day-old chicks and raising them, and of course that required grain and feed that used to come from the Holland grain and feed
Right.
Store, which was on Middle Street, and they used to deliver it to it. And they would deliver 100-pound sacks of the feed for the chickens. And they came in gaily colored cloth sacks.
Burlap.
And
Burlap.
no, it was
not
actually
burlap.
cloth. And then
Because of the war, they couldn't use the burlap.
When the sacks were emptied, my mother would wash the cloth, and then she sewed, of course. Everybody sewed in those days. And she would make little sunsuits and things like that for my sisters.
Yeah, she made all our play clothes.
And so everybody used everything in those days. And when your shoes wore out, you took them down to Mr. Feeney or Mr.
Right.
Fraticelli or
Amalotti.
Sambito or Amalotti.
Yeah.
And they tapped them, they
yeah.
fixed them, they put new soles, and they put new heels on
I
them.
remember when I was a kid, I used to
Yeah.
tap
Yeah.
new heels and
And when
taps,
socks had holes in them, your mother had a darning needle and put the sock on.
Darning egg.
Darning
still
egg
have
rather,
them.
and she darned your socks. So nothing was wasted in
Right.
those days. Everything was utilized. If a
Yeah.
cord was frayed, they would take it downtown, an iron or a toaster to Mr. Longo, Attorney John Longo's dad, who ran a fix-it shop, and he would put a new cord on for you. You didn't just throw it away. You didn't throw anything away in those days. That was interesting.
I remember that was in the 40s and the 50s.
Yes,
I remember in the 50s
exactly.
that was
Things
still...
were a little harder to come by, so
Yes.
you kept them.
Yeah, and you took
And,
care of things, and
yes.
you repaired them rather than threw them out.
And I remember in those days, too, that now we think that recycling of bottles is a new thing, fairly recent. But no, there would be a nickel a bottle
Yeah,
for the
milk
Bedoya
bottles
Brothers
and-
bottles,
yeah.
and 2 cents, I remember, for the bottles.
Tonic
and
bottles.
Tonic
and-
bottles.
Sure,
And,
soda,
So there was a, you know.
And your
that-
milk came in bottles.
Milk came in bottles.
You returned those
Yeah.
when you got your new milk. The
Yeah.
milkman picked it up.
Yeah.
And
So-
growing up here again in the 40s, the war, you saved everything. All the steel cans that things for your home came in, you opened them and you saved the covers, the tops and the bottoms, and then you crushed the can down, and they were sold for scrap metal to make
for the war effort.
shell casings for the war effort,
Right.
things like that. Yeah.
Just a little interesting anecdote. In Carter Park, there's a World War I artillery piece. I think it's an Austrian or something cannon. Lunenburg had a cannon too in their center, similar type artillery piece, and it got recycled for the war effort.
Yeah.
By some local fellows who decided to throw it into they had a big fenced-off area in the center where they would collect metal for the war effort, World War II, and they threw the cannon back at the Nazis, or the enemy, I guess.
Yeah.
so we may have to recycle this. But so many of these little anecdotes are fascinating. But the idea of your father raising the chickens and farming to supplement.
sure.
Many families did that. We talked a little bit out there. You ladies still can. I know. I guess Linda
I do.
does.
I know.
But
And Pat
canning, Pat does. Pat also got chased by a rooster, I'm told, in those days. And I had
Tell that story, Barbara. Pat wouldn't go
I
on,
got
but
bitten by a chicken when I was a
Hear
kid.
it.
I never forgot it. He knew me. I don't know which leg. but,
My
so
kid
they
sister
do
Pat
that.
was terrorized by chickens. My father.
What's the story on that? about?
Well, this, of course, she was little. She was the youngest, so it's probably like the pecking order.
so to speak.
And the rooster kept chasing her all the time. You'd hate to go into that hen yard, and I mean, there were several different hen yards, and of course I had gone in. Gone in. I got up on the summer range and it was like a chicken coop, but it was all, screens all around, so the chickens could be in there at night. And I remember getting up there, and of course I was a lot smaller then, and got on the roof, and I'm looking over at a chicken going by, and I fell off the roof and broke my arm. And then some other stories we had, like, I remember.
Now, before you continue, I on the anteroom, did you break your arm just 1 year, or did you?
Oh, I broke it another year, but I broke it on roller skates in front of the house. So. Yeah, I always had a spirit of adventure.
It was fun growing up in Morse Hollow, but it was fun growing up in Leominster in the
Yeah, it was.
40s and 50s, and it was even though you had the Second World War, you had Korea, you had economic problems, it was still a fun time to live in America. And I think one of the things that impressed me most in watching the various segments that you've had here, Bob, is the night that you had a segment on the French Hill section of Leominster, and Gil Tremblay,
Yes.
who was a
Gil, yeah.
close friend of mine, but a very articulate
Yes,
speaker.
very, very much so.
He said one of the things that he remembered most about growing up in Leominster, that nobody was afraid of anything. And my sister alluded to that earlier when she said it was a very friendly time, and that people sat out on porches and neighbors knew each other, and you walked places, and the older folks watched out for the younger folks, and it was just a very peaceful time to grow up in. And you very seldom saw a police officer or a police car come through your neighborhood. I mean, they came if necessary, but those
rare.
things were few and far
Yes.
between. And
We all
it was
watched out for each other.
It was a very, very nice era to grow up
It was, in a way, it was an age of innocence.
It
More or
was.
less,
It was
yeah.
very much that.
It really
Well,
was.
we hadn't come to the new Renaissance in America, the 60s. You hadn't arrived there
It was
yet.
before the
And-
drug culture, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, it was.
Yes.
It was. We didn't,
you know,
we didn't know
do you
anything
remem-
about drugs. Drugs was something you bought at
The drug
The
store.
The
pharmacy.
drugstore,
Right.
yeah. Do you remember as high school students and everything, we would walk downtown after high school every day. I mean, we'd go down to the BC and have a Coke, or we'd walk on Saturday nights down to TAG. I think it was TAC when we were going. I
Tag,
can't
Yeah.
remember.
Teenage Canteen, and then
Right.
Yeah.
then it changed to Tag.
Yeah.
And
Bob
you'd walk down there at
instrumental.
night, and you
We
could
hope,
walk
by the way-
alone.
We hope, he doesn't know, Bob doesn't know this, but I hope someday to get, when we do a show about the Common, I hope Bob will consent to be one of our guests.
That would
because
be
he
wonderful.
great. He would be
Yeah,
great.
he would be.
He was instrumental. It was the Teenage Canteen, TAC.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was formed by H. Martin Burns, who was
Yes,
a
right.
very
Marty
nice
Burns.
man. His
Yeah.
his wife was a principal in the school system, and they lived over on Elm Street. And I don't remember what Marty Burns did for a living, but he worked with the young folks, and he established that Teenage Canteen, and they used to have dances and music and little, you get on, play ping pong, and it was just a great social place for the young folks to go, junior high, well, basically high school level. And it was held in the auditorium of the City Hall, and the downstairs, which was the banquet room, is now the council chambers and offices. But it was kind of everybody went. Everybody went.
It really
was a
All
nice
dressed
time
up,
of life.
shined your shoes, and
Yeah.
went
Yep.
to TAC Saturday
It
nights.
was a wonderful, wonderful era. It really was. These times are still.
They are. It's just
good.
different.
But it's different. It's
Every
different.
era is fun, and
Yes.
everyone will have wonderful
Right.
memories.
Right.
The kids that grew up in the 60s and the 70s are going to have the same
Right.
nostalgia and the
Right,
same
nostalgia, good old
good
days,
feelings
right.
about their childhood.
Right.
And the kids that grew up, my kids that are growing up in the 80s and the 90s, yeah,
Well,
same thing.
It depends on one's perspective at the time. But and you folks and I have been around long enough so that we do have a perspective. Society has changed, and in some ways we have swung we're moving towards sort of an extreme, and hopefully it will come back in many ways to the more moderation, because we do swing
Oh, sure.
Oh, yeah.
the pendulum. We talked about this.
But
in
that's the
previous
era
show.
that we grew up in, and
But
you know,
It really was different. The 40s and the 50s.
Sure.
It was a different time. A
you
wonderful
read,
time.
you
it
read some
was.
of the books today, the book on the Greatest Generation, and the World War II and the Depression leading up to the war, and things like that, and it produced its heroes and its people who were the shakers and the movers and who made things happen. But this is happening even today.
Oh, yes.
So
Oh, yes.
it just continues. That's
It
that's
does.
one of the good things about our country.
Yes, yes, and indeed, especially at this time in history, somebody may be viewing this tape 100 years from now. We're involved with terrorism, and that was not
we didn't
on
have
the radar screen, so to speak,
Right.
No.
at that time.
Well, another memory that I have, when you're speaking of terrorism, we were so fortunate that this country was never attacked until 9/11.
Right.
But during the war years, I remember Pop Martin was the warden for the air raid.
This was the Second World
War. And when
Now,
the
who was
siren...
Pop Martin?
Pop Martin was Red Martin's father and Donald Martin's grandfather, and they lived on Exchange Street.
Donald is a retired firefighter for the city of Leominster.
And his father was too.
Yes.
And his daughter is vice president of the society.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Of
And
the Historical Society.
Yeah.
and he was, you know, it was kind of funny because you're supposed to have green shades on your window to block out the lights, and
Why would, I know the answer, but why, for the audience and for maybe some of the younger people, why would a family want to have no light showing from their windows at night?
well, in case of an enemy attack, an air raid,
An air raid.
enemy airplanes, because we had Devon so close to us. I think they were always afraid that maybe military establishments might get bombed. And so they had these practice runs every so often, and it was lights out, and believe me, you didn't have any lights showing.
And Pop
Martin had his flashlight, and he'd be yelling, "Shut those lights out!"
So he was the warden for the neighborhood,
Yeah,
and would
for our
go around and
neighborhood
make
he was,
sure that
yeah.
there was no light showing from
Right.
the windows.
You read today about Homeland Security and all the elaborate measures at the airports and everything, and this is wonderful. But it really happened here on a lesser level, but an effective level, even during the war years. Every neighborhood, every community had its ration board, it had its draft board,
I remember
it
the
had
draft
its
board, yes.
forerunner of the civil defense or FEMA and things like that. And you had block wardens, men who volunteered to go out when there was an air raid or when they were instructed to, and ask everyone to observe all the regulations, turn their outside lights off and pull their shades so their inside lights didn't show in the event that there were to be air observation from the enemy. And it fortunately never happened here in America, but we were prepared. We were prepared
Just
even then.
Statewide, I just a little interesting anecdote. At the State House in Boston, the Golden Dome, I believe during World War II, was painted a black or a gray, so a non-reflective
Right.
color,
Sure.
so that it wouldn't be seen perhaps from enemy submarines off the
Well,
coast or at
Yeah.
night or as a target.
Couldn't
Right.
be used as a focal
Focal
point.
point.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So,
Yeah, I
so this
remember
Homeland
that,
Security, you know,
It was
in
in
some ways, there's
effect even then. It
Even
just
then.
wasn't,
on a much
didn't have a
lesser
name,
level.
and the
Right.
catchphrases weren't as evident as they are today, but the mechanism was in place.
Mr. Martin, downtown Leominster.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about that.
He was a wonderful man, and every year at Christmas time, on the Common in Leominster, there was a little Santa Claus house. And Pop Martin was the Santa Claus.
This would be a little house
Little
where
house.
children could be brought. to
Yeah,
see
you know where
Santa.
the buses come in?
Yeah.
It was down there. And remember, I remember Jimmy Moore and his grandmother, Mrs. Champney, was visiting, and she took him to see Santa Claus. And so he asked Mrs. Champney something or other, and Jimmy said, how do you know my Nana? They live next door, you know. But he was really good. It was
He's a
a
nice man.
lot of
He's a
fun,
nice man.
you know.
And downtown Leominster, what are some of your recollections of downtown Leominster? The malls really weren't around then.
No malls.
It was a wonderful, wonderful place. There were so many people, always people walking on the streets. On Thursday night, you'd go down, you'd see everybody you knew from school. And on Saturdays, people were downtown shopping, and it was just a wonderful, busy place.
Very, very busy. And
It was marvelous.
You had everything down there. You had men's
Gladys
stores, you had women's
Yeah.
stores, the Reuben family, you had children's stores.
my favorite store as I was a kid was walking by Bodette's toy
Oh, yeah.
Toy and bicycle shop.
toy
Oh, yes.
bicycle shop.
Right.
Yeah, and then the Leominster Hardware. That sold everything. It was the forerunner of Lowe's and the Home Depot, but you went to Leominster Hardware, to get your seed for your gardens, and then in the early fall and all of a sudden they started getting toys in, and that was the center for toys for Christmas. And then of course you had W.T. Grant's and other stores.
J.J.
that-
Newberry's.
Newberry's and Pennies, and there.
Pennies.
Then toys came in there. But originally, when we were little kids, it was Leominster Hardware, and I don't know who owned it. I don't remember, but it was a
Leominster
fascinating
Hardware.
store.
Yeah. That was on Main Street, because I'm picturing an old photograph in the 50s, 40s, 50s probably, and the sign Leominster Hardware. It's right where near where Green's Drugstore used to be in that area.
Yes,
I think,
yeah,
and,
right.
Grants.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of these places are they have
gone there.
these names have a meaning to people who grew up in Leominster of a certain age, but to new folks.
Do you remember the shoe store that you would go in and they would
Yes.
take an X-ray of your feet?
Yes.
Yeah, that was-
I always thought that was
I
fascinating.
I
was,
worked in there
Yeah, I
one
can see-
time.
Did you?
Joel
I can-
Parent.
Parents.
I can picture my feet
Yeah.
and looking at the bones of my. I don't know if that would be allowed today
Oh
because
no,
of
too
the
Oh,
much
I know it.
radiation.
green. Yeah, you could see.
On the other hand, you didn't go in there twice a year. I
No.
mean, you only went
Right.
in once a year. So it probably didn't do as much harm as we thought.
And I remember J.C. Penney's. They used to have like a balcony where the ladies who did the record keeping, and they had a
Overhead,
basket system with,
yeah.
on
Right.
trolleys, and you'd buy something, and there was a
send the
basket.
money.
She'd put the cash in, and then she'd pull the thing,
Pull
and
the
it
chain
would
and go up
zoom
to the office.
Yeah.
The change would come
Absolutely.
back.
That was fascinating.
Yes.
That was a
Oh, I
wonderful
thought it
thing
was a
for
big
kids
deal.
to see.
Oh yeah.
To
And
me, it
yet,
wasn't.
if you go to a bank today, to the drive-up window,
That's right.
and
Yeah.
you take
Yeah.
your little container out, and you put your money and your
Yeah.
deposit slip in, and it goes through a pneumatic
Yep.
tube and straight into
Same-
the bank.
same
The
idea.
same principle exists,
Yep.
except that it's done,
By air pressure.
With,
They do that
machinery.
down to a Home Depot.
Sure.
They have that
Yeah.
that system where they will
Yeah.
send the things up through.
You know,
the pipes.
Barbara and Pat and I sat down one day at the Historical Society, and we looked at a few pictures, and they started naming stores that I just couldn't even remember, but they knew every single one of them, and they knew where each one of those stores was. I thought that was terrific.
And on Main Street, I think it's where the Sentinel office is now, is Good Hughes Restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
And they had the best food, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, we used to go in there. I think we went in there Christmas Eve because the day before Christmas, we all, the Mahan family, walked to church to go to confession. And
St.
then
Leo's.
St. Leo's. And then we went to Good Hughes for supper. And most of the time, by the time we got back home, Santa Claus had come. You know?
The memories you trigger. By the way, Mr. Goodhue, Joseph Goodhue, just celebrated his 90th birthday.
He's a very nice man.
Yes, he is.
Oh, I
Yes.
heard.
And he's still
Yeah.
living in Leominster, but way up on Main Street, up past the turnout on the right. And he's a very nice man. He's a
Sure
good
is.
friend of mine.
Surely is. And hopefully, when we do the downtown section, he'll be another person who would be able to.
Oh, I can't wait to
contribute
hear
so
that
much.
one. That'd be
but
great.
Good Hughes Restaurant, I think that's the restaurant that my Aunt Teresa mentions when she was a young lady and she worked at, I think she worked at Foster Grant at that time. One of the treats that she and her girlfriends there was a big treat when they got paid. They would go in, I think it was Good Hughes, and there was a toasted cheese sandwich with a pimento or something, I'm not sure, and that was a big treat for her. Good Hughes
Sure.
restaurant. I have a vague recollection of what it was like inside, but downtown, we have restaurants, they were fast food, but they were real sit-down restaurants.
Right.
And,
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And Monty's was there at
Monty's,
that time.
long.
Yeah,
And
that
when you
was-
went up to
that was
Monty's,
a-
it was
that was
such
always
a
a
treat
nice
to go up
place to
there
go,
because they
yeah.
had jukeboxes
Yeah.
in the booth. I thought that was really fun. I remember that.
And did you ever go downstairs at Sabatelli's to listen to?
Oh,
yes,
the records,
You
yeah.
could buy the records, and there were the 45s and the
And they had individual cubicles,
Yeah.
and you could play the records before you bought them, and
Yeah.
it was wonderful.
Yeah. No, this was an era, no tapes, no cassettes,
CDs.
no CDs. TV was there, but it was
For the
in
very
its infancy.
few.
And it wasn't on 24 hours a day.
No.
There were only 3 channels, and I remember the pattern of an Indian chief. Many of the hours were just blank. And then I think at 11 o'clock there would be the Pledge of Allegiance, the Star Spangled Banner, and there'd be a sign off, and then it was
Yeah.
just gray fuzz.
Just the test
And
pattern or
then,
something.
and then a test pattern would come on, and so things have really
changed.
changed. We're nearing the conclusion of our interview.
we talked briefly, and you said, what was the most exciting thing that happened when I was growing up in Morse Hollow? And just above us, way up Exchange Street, there was a greenhouse, Allen's Greenhouse. And they had a couple of horses. And one day in midsummer, all of a sudden there was a horse galloping up Exchange Street toward West Street. And we all saw it, and of course, Mr. Allen and his brother, who were, we called them old men, they were probably in their 40s then, came down the street about 10 minutes later with harnesses in their hands, and they were going to look for their horse, who somebody finally stopped downtown somewhere.
So-
This was in the late 40s, but that was a very exciting day.
That would have been exciting for kids.
Barbara.
Barbara, any?
Yes, my sister kind of reminded me of this. At the end of World War II, we had a cousin by the name of Florence Conlon, and she had a car, and our family didn't. But she picked up the 5 Mahans and brought us all downtown for the celebration for the end of World War II.
BJ
So
Day.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I remember Miss Collins. She was my wonderful art
She was a
teacher.
right,
professor at
professor
Pittsburgh State.
Linda, very, very quickly, because
I really don't have a major thing. It was all so great. I just
was.
loved it. It just
That
all
time,
blends together.
I want to thank Jack. I want to thank Barbara. I want to thank Linda. I want to thank Pat and Diana for this wonderful interview. I want to thank, as always, Kyle Pimarini and Jack Sully. Tina, who is working the desk, Tina Pimarini, Fred Ailes, and Chuck Amaral for making this program possible. And as always, I want to thank the LATV audience for tuning in to Neighborhood Snapshot. Thank you very much.